So today I'm going to be walking through how I approach painting a tree in acrylics. Trees for me have always been really intimidating because they're so wildly detailed. All the leaves, all the shadows, all the branches, it's a lot. And recently, like in the past, just since I've picked up painting again, I've really started to get more comfortable with how I paint trees, and I wanted to show my approach on how I actually do that with acrylics. So we're kind of do a conceptual walkthrough. You can paint along with me. I'm actually going to be using this photo that I'm going to put up on screen so you can see it too. It's a pretty complicated looking tree. It can look pretty intimidating, but I'm going to show you all of my steps for like looking at a tree as a reference and then kind of processing it to put it on my paper, my canvas, or whatever I'm using. The full-length version of this tutorial, me talking through the whole thing, painting every brush stroke, is going to be up on my Patreon for all the nice people who support me there. If you don't know what Patreon is, it's a platform where you can support creators that you love and get some cool rewards in return. So check that out if you're interested. But if supporting me financially is not in your budget whatsoever, subscribing to the channel and watching my videos is also a great free way for you to help me continue to do what I do and put out cool painting stuff. On to the tutorial. Okay, so I already put my paint on my canvas, but I still have to draw my tree first, so I just gotta give it a little spray with this little mister so it doesn't dry out. So I've got a little panel here. This is just a little wood panel. It's primed with gesso. Doesn't really matter that much for you, but I did want to put down a little bit of a blue background. I just scrubbed some blue paint on there to kind of emulate the sky because we're gonna have our sky showing through, and I didn't want to just paint like a floating tree on a white space. I wanted to give it a tiny little bit of dimension. I'm maybe gonna put a little foreground for it to sit on, some background, but we're not worried about that right now. We're just focusing on how to draw the tree itself and paint the tree itself. But that starts with drawing the tree. So I know a lot of painters that don't have a painting background get really freaked out about having to draw their subject on their canvas or board or whatever they're working on. But the more you practice it, the better it's gonna be. So what I'm gonna do first is kind of assess where I want the top of my tree and the bottom of my tree to be within my canvas space. So I think I want the tippy top to be somewhere around there, make a little mark with my pencil, and the bottom to be somewhere around here. And this just gives me some boundaries to go between. And so what I do is I look at my reference photo now, and I generally sketch out the outline blob very loosely of the tree. I'm just looking at the reference and then grabbing general blobs that I see and throwing them on. This is not at all my final sketch or what my final tree is gonna look like. This is just to get me started. So I've got my blob, I'm looking at the proportions over here generally. Instead of just drawing in individual tiny little leaves and trying to do that, there's no way we can do that, there's no way. I want to look at the clumps of leaves almost as circles or spheres and start drawing those spheres onto my board. So sticking with maybe the ones that are like closest to me first. So I see right here, that big one at the bottom is kind of like a big ovular clump of leaves. So now that we have all of our weird circles in, I'm going to sketch in what I can see of the branches and the trunks, pretty minimally. I think I'm gonna focus here on the big trunk, obviously right here at the bottom, this main branch that goes up there, this little branch here, maybe a little something there, but keep it fairly general. So I notice that this trunk, definitely wider at the bottom, so it widens out there. It's got a couple little branchy legs that go out like this. Not as much worried about this. And it pulls up through the middle. I made mine a little bit wider than I want it to be, like that. And then here you can't see most of it because it's within the leaves, but I'm gonna draw it there just for the sake of knowing where it is. And then up here, it branches and curves. So now I'm gonna go in and more angularly define these spheres and block in the general shapes of my little puffs of leaves, starting here at the bottom. So I see, I'm looking at the angles that these leaves are moving in. Seeing some like trapezoids down here at the bottom. So I'm just turning all of these circles into clumps of shapes that look a lot closer to the tree clumps that are actually on the tree. I'm taking my time to look at their shapes and sketch them out. I'm also using this photo as a reference, obviously, but it does not have to be exactly like this tree by any means. I'm just using it as a guide so that I can have a good gist of what a tree could look like. I've got a big clump of sky that you can see a lot of sky through here. So I want to make sure that stays open. I've got some other sky clumps here in these areas that I'm gonna draw in to leave open. I'm not gonna worry about those open parts of the sky that you're seeing the sky through the trees, branches, and the leaves and stuff. We're gonna come back and add those back in. It might be a good idea to define your lines a little bit more and make sure you know exactly what is going where. So I'm gonna leave that sketch like that. So I've got my paints here, spraying them once again to make sure they stay damp. The colors I'm using are ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, yellow medium azo. I've got a permanent magenta and a titanium white. We're gonna start with a bigger brush and then move to a smaller brush as we go along, blocking in the shadowed parts of our tree. So you can see the light hits the top parts of the leaves, and then as you get deeper into the tree, things get darker, especially right here in the center, underneath where all the shadows are. The light's coming from the top. We want to make sure that we are defining the shadows. Some people do this in different orders. I like to do the shadow definition first and kind of focus on creating that contrast, focusing on the, what do you call it, like tones? Defining what my tones are, my darks and my lights, to get an idea of where my painting is going. So I'm mixing up a dark green, and I'm doing that by taking ultramarine, some yellow, and then a little bit of magenta to mute it down. Oh, I just realized I missed a little something. Going with my shadow, I'm looking at my reference photo, I'm looking at my sketch. I'm gonna avoid my center branch, and I'm drawing in areas where the shadows are going to be. And I'm fairly quickly locking in those shadows. I've really in my brain reduced and simplified what this tree looks like. This is just our first pass with the shadow, so don't worry if it's not perfect. Don't worry if you drew over lines that you didn't actually want to draw over. I'm going to, since I blocked those in, I'm getting a little more water on my brush, and I'm actually bringing a little bit more of this dark color with more water on my brush. And washes up into the parts of these little leaf blobs that are gonna have some transitional color in it. So I'm just bringing a little bit of color to roughen this up, give me a little more to work with in these areas before I go in now with a mid-tone green. So this is not gonna be our lightest color, but it's gonna be kind of the bulk general color, the general tone of the highlights of our trees. To make that green, I'm gonna just leave some of this green from the shadows in. I'm gonna bring in my cerulean and some yellow. I'm gonna try and avoid using white yet, because I want to use that for my highlights when that comes up. We're taking our same big brush, And we're now gonna focus on the highlighted parts of our trees, those bright green top parts of the blobs. Trying to pay attention a lot more now to the angles that I drew on my blobs and keeping those forms pretty consistent with my sketch, and at the same time still looking at my reference photos. So if I'm seeing anything, being like, actually, I don't like how I did that part. I think I'm gonna switch that up. I can in the moment. Again, it's okay for some of this color to go over our shadow areas. We're gonna come in with shadow details later, but it's like a tree is like a ball of leaves, and the ball is gonna have the most light hitting the outside of it, and as you go in like a transparent ball, it's gonna get darker and darker and darker. So our furthest inside pieces are where our shadows are. This guy, a little more color here. Again, I'm just going back over some of my spots and make sure it's as covered as I want it to be. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can see the brush strokes and you can see some of that blue coming through. That is totally fine. I just want to keep it fairly even, but keeping some of my brushy textures. I like those brushy textures. So we've got the basics of the leaves blocked in. Shadows, midgrounds, we'll add the highlights later. Don't worry about that. And I want to mix up a color to represent the bulk of what our trunk is. So I can see there's lots of different colors on this trunk. I've got this really highlighted area here that's like almost white cream. I've got this darker brown area in here with some dappled light. I see areas in here that are not quite as light as the cream there at the bottom and have some like green areas. So many colors, I don't even know where to start. So what I'm gonna do instead is look at the general overall color of these branches and paint that. So I don't want it to be too dark or too light. Oh, you know what? Another color that I really like to use. If you don't have this color, that's totally fine. But I'm throwing on my palette a little bit of this burnt sienna. It's just a really nice brown. And if you struggle with mixing brown, it's a good starting place for you right here. But I'm going to actually just mix up this brown using my yellow, my magenta, and a little bit of blue to mute it down, and a little bit of white. So if you don't have that burnt sienna, don't worry about it. All you need are these like basically primary colors. And we're gonna block in this generalized color. Kind of sketchy block it in, just so we have all of our bases covered, all of our groundwork set. I actually have some of this color coming through. I'm gonna pull it up into there just a little bit. So the next part is the part that I honestly find the most fun and satisfying. It is to look at our reference photo and look at what parts of the sky are coming through the trees. All the little holes that are coming through from where the leaves are just slightly separated. So we got a really big one here that we blocked in, obviously, but if you look and zoom in, there's a bunch of spaces where the light of the sky is coming through the tree, showing that the tree is not like a one giant blocky mass, like how this tree looks like right now. Like this looks like a very polygonal video game tree. We want it to have more depth, more dimension, more detail, and we can add to the illusion of that detail by getting a smaller brush, finding those areas of light coming through and bringing them back in over our groundwork here. So I'm going to mix up a sky blue. I want a lot of it. White and blue. And it's okay if it's a little bit darker, slightly different color than this groundwork we put in. You will see why. So I'm gonna start by looking at the edges of my tree reference photo and seeing that there's like more angles in here than the big fat angles that I originally blocked in to put the colors on. So I want to look at the tree and start by, in this area, defining those edges and making them a little crunchier, just a little bit. So I'm keeping it rough, I'm keeping it loose, scrubbing this paint wherever I need it to go. All right, So still pretty rough, but you can see I've got some more jagged edges there on my tree. And now I'm gonna go in with my small brush, my little detail brush. I'm gonna add a little bit of water so my paint flows pretty nicely. And I'm looking for all those holes, those parts where the light is showing through. So let's zoom in and see. We've got clumps of light coming in through here, through there, coming down, got some in there. If you don't like the placement of some of them, you don't have to go off the reference photo. You can change it up, do whatever you want. And you can see how the tree starts to get more of a three-dimensional look when you start bringing in these little bits of light all over the painting. So again, we can always go in with more detail. This is still a bigger brush than our final brush needs to be. So don't worry about keeping everything super perfect. Keep it loose, keep it fun. All right, let's leave that right now. Let's use the same sized brush and start bringing in the highlights that are gonna sit on the top part. So I'm mixing up some of that green that we'd used for the mid-tone color, and I'm adding it with some yellow and a little bit of white this time to brighten it up a lot. So this highlight is gonna sit on the top part of our leaf clumps. And we're gonna keep it, instead of trying to draw individual leaves here, we're drawing just like angular groups of highlight. Kind of in the same way that we approached drawing out the groups of leaves when we first sketched them out with pencil. We're looking at our reference photo and following a similar approach. Looking for those angles, looking for the parts where the light's hitting, keeping in mind that our sun is coming from basically the top. This looks like it's almost like high noon when this reference photo was taken. So we're keeping in mind our sun's placement as we're building up these highlights and creating more contrast to give a more 3D and lifelike effect to our tree. I'm starting to take more and more time on each little layer of paint that I'm putting on. Now, while we're at this stage and still on this brush size, I'm going to add a little more detail to our little trunk. So we've got some details like highlights that we need to add in. So I'm sketching up this creamy color that we've got here at the bottom. Getting to the part of our tree where most of the stuff is blocked in, and it's all about adding whatever kind of little details we want now. So now we are moving to an even smaller brush size. What do I got here? What do I got? Ooh, I like this one. It's kind of similar. A little bit smaller, and we're going to use it for some of these smaller details. So we're going to take our green here that we used for our first highlight, we're going to add white, and we're going to add lots of yellow. So we're taking up this light green there, a little bit more white and yellow we added to our last green color, and we are a little bit more judiciously tapping in some little highlights in more like of a dot kind of shape. It's more of a tap than a scrub like we've been doing before, because we're now just adding a little more of that illusion of detail. I almost tried to zoom in on my painting. Oh boy. noticing too, this is something with acrylics in particular that I notice, is that as I work through, they dry darker than they appear when they're wet, and it always throws me for a loop. And so I'm always like, well, I want my highlight to be lighter, so then I just add more and more highlight layers. So now this is basically the finished painting pretty much. What I'm gonna do from here is go in with tiny, tiny, tiny little details that I wanna add. I wanna add some itty bitty little shadows into some of these lighter areas. I wanna add some lighter areas back into some of the shadowed parts to give it some more texture. I might throw in a little bit of some scrubby brush down here and maybe a little piece of grass for this tree to sit on. But this is kind of the general way I approach painting a tree. From this point, I'm getting real itty bitty. Look at that. I'm going to look for areas that I want to accentuate the shadows on. So I see some dark, dark areas. Oh, getting paint all over myself. I'm going to mix up a shadow color once again. I'm going to add some of that shadow back in there. Sticking with this small brush tappy motion once again, in contrast to the big brush kind of swoopy scrubby motion like I was doing before. Now I'm using like a not that a darkish green, but not like a super, super dark green. And I'm tapping in some texture. I'm just tapping in areas to create a little more texture in the highlighted areas, create a little more transition from the highlights to the darks. I'm gonna add one more itty bitty highlight color. Just a little bit more white and yellow. And with I think my little brush, just get a little bit of this highlight at the very top of our tree. I don't want to go overboard on this. Just want to accentuate a couple of these areas where I know a lot of light is hitting. Really, really quick, I want to scrub in a little bit of a background for a tree to sit on, just a little bit. Some bushes in the background, like that. Just a little bit of shrubs here, but that shrub right behind it is going to be pretty in shadow. Loosely sketch in some little grass clumps. All right, let's call that done. So obviously it's very rough, it's very loose. If you wanted a more realistic detailed tree, all you have to do is kind of keep repeating those same steps where you keep going in with more and more detail. And eventually you can get a tree that looks almost exactly like this. This is a really great way to just take something that's so complicated and seems so intimidating and just break it down into smaller chunks and build up the tree that you want. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions about it, leave them in the comments below. I'll try to answer as many as possible. If you have any suggestions for, well, you know what, as we're saying this, I'm like, I need another branch. If you have any suggestions for any paintings you'd like to see me do, let me know in the comments below. I would love to be able to show you exactly what you want to see. I'd love to be able to like teach what people are struggling with and try and like help out. If you'd like to help me out in any way, you can subscribe to this channel, that helps me a lot. Or if you want some bonus content from me and want to like really help me and be a super supporter, you can support me on Patreon. That's a great way to get me to be able to continue to make all this stuff. So, after I throw in a couple extra branches here, boop, boop, boop. That looks like plenty, I need to stop anyway. We're gonna call this painting done, and I'll see you in the next video. I'm running super low on paint. I gotta mix up some more. I'm playing like paint chicken.